I'd like to wrap up the topic of movement with just a few subtopics that we could explore more fully if we had more time. One of the most productive areas of science in studying movement has recently been robotics, because, well, robotics places great challenges, and it's a case of put your money where your mouth is. If you believe you have a theory of movement, then build something that moves. And so a lot of what we found out from robotics has been of the nature of a reality check. People have found that their theories don't always fare well when translated into the mechanics of actual machines. Shown here are two examples of American robots, early ones, must be said. But what you can see is that these robots have taken clever advantage by building, as it were, smartness into the legs of the robots. On the left we have from Cornell a passive walker. This robot has no motor whatsoever, but on a passive incline it will automatically walk down it thanks to its very heavy feet. Its very heavy feet make use of gravity to induce an oscillation which self-organizes into a locomoting system. All very clever and no controller. On the right, you can see another solution by Rodney Brooks, who we've met before. Rodney Brooks here cleverly avoided many of the problems of balancing on 2 or 3 legs using 6 legs. So taking a leaf from the insects book, here a lot of the problems of locomotion become much easier if you can always keep 3 legs on the ground, providing a stable base of support as you move 3 other legs. So again, very clever engineering in the legs, not in any kind of a brain. Here you can see 2 robots that illustrate rather different approaches to robotics, and different parts of the world have different cultures of robotics, as it were. In America, they tend to be ugly and very practical. In Japan, as we'll see, they tend to be very humanoid and somewhat whimsical. The one on the left there is a European project from a European funded project called Robot Cub, in which a great deal of work was done in developing an appropriate body for robotics with no controller at all, no brain, but placing all the emphasis on getting the right kinds of limbs, the right kind of joints, the right kind of actuators, the right kind of sensors, and to end up with the body of more or less a toddler. And these are currently forming the basis of very many active research programs in Europe. Asimo there is a famous space age kind of robot from Japan, and here's some more Japanese robots. You can see they tend towards the whimsical and the playful, often with humanoid forms, often informed by science fiction, and compare that with this ugly beast, Big Dog from Boston Dynamics. Many of you will have seen this. This is a little bit old now. This is 10 years old, this video, but when this first came out, it was absolutely astonishing. This firm, Boston Dynamics, has clearly learned something about movement. Here you can see self-correction after perturbation. Here you can see it dealing with all kinds of really difficult environments. And as ugly and loud as this is, it's an extremely successful robotics platform, which has been developed. So these have been envisaged for very many scenarios. Here you're seeing the use of this in what might be a search and rescue environment after an earthquake. Unfortunately, most of these robots have been developed with military purposes in mind, and Boston Dynamics initially, all its research was on the wraps because it was done for the military. Here's a very famous one. This is quite recent. This is Atlas, showing off doing some gymnastics here. Very, very controlled. Atlas is the latest generation. It was originally called Petman. That was the first humanoid one that they built. And it was built for the purpose of testing chemical warfare suits. I can't stress enough, these are not robots that are made in order to entertain, or indeed necessarily for the good of humankind, though many uses they might have are good. Most of this research has been conducted by the military, for the military, and most of it has been classified. Boston Dynamics, the very famous company who produces these world-class robots, was founded in 1992. Google bought it up in 2013, but they sold it on again to a Japanese bank. Heaven knows why. So that little look into robotics. I've been steering us away from thinking about the nervous system because of the need to avoid the notion that the brain is doing everything, that the brain is controlling the body. But we should know what the principal parts of the nervous system that are involved in the business of coordinating the body are. And there are three I want you to pay attention to. The brain on the left, in the top left there, is facing to the right, so the front of that brain is to the right. At the back of the brain, you can see a piece called a cerebellum. It hangs beneath the brain like a little mini brain. From an evolutionary point of view, it's quite old, and we'll see it has a role in stabilizing movements, making coordinations stable. The primary motor cortex is that blue band, which is the rearmost part of the frontal lobe of the brain. And there we find nerve cells which project down through the spinal cord, leading ultimately to the muscles that carry out voluntary movement. So those are involved in carrying out overt, explicit voluntary movement. And then deep within the brain, there's a bunch of very complex structures, very old from an evolutionary point of view, known collectively as the basal ganglia. And their role, if you want to think of it, might be compared to that of the conductor in an orchestra. So the conductor doesn't play the oboe, but the conductor tells the oboe when to start, how intense to be, how to coordinate with other parts of the orchestra. That's kind of like the role of the basal ganglia. The primary motor cortex, we've met briefly before when we looked at the primary somatosensory cortex. They lie together and each of them has this kind of homuncular representation. We've learned to use that word carefully. So those are the three principal parts of the nervous system that we need to pay attention to as we study coordinated movement. The principal source of nerve impulses to muscles is the primary motor cortex. The cerebellum stabilizes well-learned coordinations, and the basal ganglia sequence and fine-tune sequencing. And so far in this section, we have looked primarily at locomotion. We've looked at simple kinds of movement that are common across all kinds of animals. And they all involve oscillation. They all involve the coordination of multiple parts of the body in roughly periodic movements. Now, locomotion is roughly periodic, and so most of the models we have, most of our understanding of movement here, has to do with how oscillating systems interact. But we, of course, do many kinds of complex actions that are not simply periodic in any sense. And perhaps the best example of this is speech movement, which is by no means simply repetitive. You wouldn't learn much if all we did was ba 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 ba. It requires complex sequences of movements which are all done in the mouth and from the diaphragm up, the back of the mouth, the top of the mouth. You're not usually conscious of what you're doing. You don't even know how you do it, but you are executing extremely finely sequenced movements. This bears a close relation to the kind of movements we do with our fingers as well. We have very, very fine control over our fingers, and we're capable of doing non-repetitive, carefully sequenced movement. So this suggests that there's something about sequences of finely tuned movements that is special, and that links the movement of the hands with the movement of the speech system, and that would be correct. And furthermore, we have an interesting animal analog you might not have expected. Rodents have very characteristic grooming patterns, which are also complex sequences of sequenced movement. And we know that there are specific parts of the brain that are involved in sequencing these and making sure they are carried out in one order and not in another order. And that looks remarkably like language, actually, because sequencing and coordination is a good way of describing what we're doing as we allow the various movements to make manifest the kind of linguistic contrasts that are at the heart of speech. Furthermore, we find as we move from one species of rodent to another, we find something very like grammar in their syntax, in their grooming movements. That is, for one species, there are particular sequences of movements which are allowed, and those are not allowed for another species. Remarkable similarities there. Speech is a notoriously complex domain, And when we think about what movements are involved in speech, we have movements from respiration, which are less than 1 second. We've got the lips, tongue, velum, all the movements of the mouth, which are moving at about 5 times a second as we produce syllables. And then in the voice box here, we've got the vocal folds, which are flapping at anything from 8 to 300 times a second. So 3 very different time scales, all of which have to be coordinated together. And it has been suggested that this requires something beyond motor control in any other domain. One of the things that makes speech movement very special is that it's not done in close interaction with the environment. It's all done behind the lips. You can speak and chew on a pencil or a pipe or chew gum at the same time, but by and large, where most movement involves interaction with the environment, speech movement is relatively isolated. And we've got this range of time scales, and it's all done to convey symbolic, discrete information at a high transmission rate. So there's lots of puzzles there as well. Motor control of the hands and of the speech articulators places very different challenges to us than the simply periodic movement of locomotion. With that, we'll wrap up the topic of movement, and we have one large topic left, which is consciousness.